Like it says here, I'm the founder of domdog.io. But today she gave a good introduction for me. Yesterday when I met her, she was like, "You are that something domdog guy, right?" So no, something dog guy, right? So yeah, I hope you guys don't call me a something dog guy, and remember the actual name, which is domdog, right? Okay, so I think the entire day you've been seeing a lot of sessions about a lot of cool frameworks, functionalities, and things of that nature. You use all of that to build really good applications, but once you build them, and like the previous talk, you profile them, you make them really performant, and when you have put out this really awesome application, one thing which probably you don't put a lot of focus on is in security, right? Especially when you look at front-end security, because our focus typically tends to be on the back end. If I were to ask you, how many of you have a website published or your app published on the internet without a firewall? Raise of hands. Without a firewall. Okay. Couple of brave people, I think, they have put it out without a firewall. A lot of confidence. But if I were to ask you, how many of you have a firewall for your front end? I think the number would almost be zero, or there would be very few people. So that's the current state of affairs, where we put a lot of focus on the security of our backend, but for our front end, we don't really do much. And if you think about it, if you consider your backend to be, like a safe, I don't have to, as a thief, I don't have to break the safe. All I have to do is steal a key, and your front end is the key to all the backend data and functionality, right? If I can get my code to execute in the front end, I can use all your existing functionality and access all the backend data and backend functionality. So that's a problem which a lot of people do not give attention to. And what that has resulted in is in a lot of attacks happening on the front end. Because if you do not know something about attackers or hackers, I come from the security world, I can tell you, they're typically lazy people. So they don't want to do very complicated things. They go behind what you call as low-hanging fruit. So whichever section of your infrastructure is the most weakest in terms of security is what they typically tend to focus on. And because client-side infrastructure is typically more insecure, over the last few years, we've been seeing a lot of attacks against the client side. And this has resulted in several hundreds of millions of credit card details being lost, right? So this is a very, very serious problem. It has become so serious that even industry bodies like PCI, I'm sure some of you are aware of PCI, payment card industry. So PCI 4.0, which is the next standard, they have made client-side security controls as mandatory controls, right? So that's how serious this is. So this is something you will have to, look into. And in this talk, I'll talk about how you can actually put in some security controls and how you can, go about practically implementing them. Okay, if you think about, should I think about security for my site, then if your site has any of these kind of functionalities, or if it falls into these categories, then probably you should take client-side security more seriously. All right, how many of you are familiar with CSP? Like a show of hands. Okay, so that's about 5 to 10% of the audience, right? So CSP is that client-side firewall I was talking about, right? It's a built-in standard with the browser. So it's not something you will have to install. It's not an external framework that you have to worry about. It's a built-in standard. It's been in browsers for several, like more than a decade almost by this point. And by turning it on, you can actually have a lot of security on your client side, right? So I would actually say use client-side security and make the attacker sweat a little, right? You don't have to sweat. You should make them sweat. So conceptually, what a firewall is, it's similar to, CSP is similar to firewall. Like I said, a firewall will typically have a bunch of rules, and those rules will define what kind of communication is allowed and what kind of communication is not allowed, right? So the CSP works in a similar way. Using CSP, you can define what kind of resources your front end can load, and from where those resources can be loaded. For example, you can say, I want my site to only load images from abc.com. Right? So once you define it in a policy, then your browser, even although you have an image SRC tag pointing to, say, 123.com, your browser will not load that image, right? Because the policy says it should only load images from abc.com. So that's at a very high level how a CSP policy works. And you add it in your HTTP response header. And the good thing is you can have it in blocking mode or you can have it in monitoring mode. So what this means is you can have your policy, but you can put it in such a mode that it does not break any functionality of your site. But if it sees a policy violation, it will actually send you an alert. So you are informed that your site is doing something which is not in compliance with your policy. So it gives you some visibility into what's happening on your website. All right. So that's at a high level what CSP is. But when you look at implementing CSP, I'm sure the few of you who did raise your hands, how many of you have actually implemented CSP? That's like about 4 or 5 people, right? Okay. So, so one thing you would have actually faced is, especially if your site is a little dynamic, is that implementing CSP is very tricky. And the reason is CSP works based on allow listing, which is you can only define what is a good behavior and anything else is a violation of the policy. And it's very hard to define what is good behavior without running the risk of actually breaking your site. So this makes CSP implementation typically hard, but by following a few tricks, you can actually do it in a very relatively simpler manner. Okay, so I'll give you some simple steps. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll give you some few basic steps and I'll also show you how you can do some of them. All right, so we'll break down our CSP implementation into 2 primary stages. Stage 1 is we create a monitoring mode policy, and stage 2 is we create a blocking mode policy, right? So you can complete stage 1, and if you just stay there, still you get a lot of benefits, but you will have to look at them as 2 different stages, and you will have to achieve each stage individually, right? Otherwise, you kind of run into you risk getting confused in your process, right? So let's put them into 2 stages, and let's see how we can attack stage 1. All right, so in stage 1, what we are going to do is we're going to create a monitoring mode policy. And with a monitoring mode policy, the benefit is we do not have any risk of breaking the functionality of a site because it will not block any features. It will only send as an alert, right? We'll have to pair it with a CSP report monitoring system. A report monitoring system is a service which will collect all the violations which your browser will send for your CSP violations. And it will analyze them and it will use some intelligence and it will give you some very actionable information, right? So if you have a monitoring mode policy and if you pair it with like a good report monitoring service, then you can actually have very good attack detection capability and you have visibility into what's happening on your client side, right? From a security point of view. Like I'm sure a lot of people use Sentry to look at what's happening with your errors which happen in your client side. I'm sure you have other systems to monitor performance. So this could be your first step towards monitoring the security aspect of your client side. Okay, so now let's look at how you can create a monitoring mode policy, right? So we have created a scanner, which is located at scanner.domdoc.io. It's a free scanner. It's based on WebAssembly. And it's very easy to use. You just have to start a scan and browse a website. And you stop scan and it'll generate a report for you. So in the interest of time, I've actually generated a report already. And I'll go to protection status. And you can see there's an auto-generated CSP policy. If I go there, then it'll show me a CSP policy that is generated for my website, right? So I can just take this and I can use it for my site. You could have a working monitoring mode CSP policy in about 5 to 10 minutes at max. It'll take you some time to deploy it on your site, of course, but the policy itself, you could have it in 5 to 10 minutes, right? So for ones who have not seen a CSP policy, this is what it kind of looks like. So you define, like I was talking about images, you define the behavior of images using image SRC, and you can give a list of domains from where you want to load images, right? So this is typically how a CSP policy looks. And what this tool also does is, it will generate a policy. For your existing policies, it will also analyze them. Like in this case, I've looked at Google. I can look at the existing policies on Google, and it will also tell me what is the kind of security measure that we have on the existing policy, right? What weaknesses it has and so on. So if your existing policy is weak, you can find it out from here, and it will also tell you how you can address that particular weakness, right? So the ideal goal would be that you have a good coverage across all the different sections that it highlights, okay? So you can use this as a benchmark to kind of get to a very good monitoring mode policy status. Okay? All right, so let's say you have created the monitoring mode policy. Then we, at this point, have completed stage 1, where you have visibility into what's happening on your client side. And if an attack does take place, then at the very least you will be informed about it, right? Which is a good place to be at. Okay, so now once we have achieved this, let's look at stage 2, which is blocking mode policy. And if you cannot go to stage 2, stage 1 is still a good place to be at, right? Compared to where you are currently, where only about 5% have a CSP policy. Stage 1 is still a good place to be at. All right, so now let's go to stage 2. This is where things get tricky, and because you're trying to now go into blocking mode where there is a risk of breaking the functionality of your site. So this is where people struggle quite a lot. They're like, hey, if I put a strong policy, I could break my site, or the only way I can have a strong blocking mode policy without breaking my site is I'll have to water down my policy quite a bit, right? So this is a kind of a dilemma people get into, but it does not have to be this way. The reason why people get stuck in this issue is because there is a common mistake they make, which is they take their existing monitoring mode policy and they turn the entire policy into a blocking mode policy, right? Which is a very bad approach. It could work if your site is very static, you don't use a lot of third party and so on, then maybe that works for you. But for most people, this is not a very ideal approach to take. And I personally know people who created a monitoring mode policy, and they've been like waiting for up to a year to go into blocking mode. They're like, okay, next week I'll go into blocking mode. Next week they'll go into blocking mode. They never really muster the courage to go into blocking mode and risk breaking the website. What we can instead do is, there's a different approach, which is, I don't know if many of you know, that is your browser will support multiple CSP policies at the same time. Okay? So what you can do is, you can have your monitoring mode policy as is without touching it, and you can parallelly start creating a blocking mode policy. And your blocking mode policy can have small sections from the monitoring mode policy added here. Okay? So what you will do is, let's say for example, you have your form submission. Right? So form submissions are typically more, in the sense, they're not that dynamic. In the sense, you might submit forms to 2-3 domains, but that that domain list does not change quite that often. So you could put form submissions into the blocking mode policy first, right? Because that's kind of easy to do. Images, maybe it's hard to do. Let's say if you're an e-commerce company, you're loading images from lots of different domains, and the list of domains keeps changing, on a constant basis. Maybe you will never be able to put image SRC in blocking mode, right? So you can leave image SRC in the monitoring mode, no problem. The rest of the directives, you can start moving them one by one to blocking mode. And the way in which you can decide is you can look at which directives are more serious, let's say scripts. So you would want to ensure that you don't load scripts from unauthorized domains. So script, you can move to your blocking mode, you can give it higher preference over something like images, for example, right? So by doing this, you might not get to a perfect policy, in the sense you might not have everything in blocking mode, but you can get to an ideal policy for your particular situation, right? Which is far better than trying to have one policy in blocking mode, which is pretty much watered down, right? So this is something you can do. And for scripts, if your script domains are changing constantly, like in the sense there's a lot of dynamic third-party scripts that is being loaded, then you will not be able to give a list of domains saying, hey, I only want to load scripts from here. But instead, there is another option called as nonce and stick dynamic. So you can read about all of those directives online, right? But this is an approach you can use by which you do not have to, even if you are loading scripts dynamically, you will still be able to go into blocking mode for scripts, right? So that's a little tip you can use. Right, okay, so these are some strategies at a high level, which you can, if you follow, you might be able to get to a reasonably good CSP policy for your site. And in terms of timelines, these are rough estimates again. So monitoring mode policy, you should be able to get one in about a week for static sites, and for very dynamic sites, even you can get one in about 2 weeks' time. And blocking mode policy, these are the rough time estimations. So this is just to give you an idea so that you can plan your project accordingly. You don't start off very optimistic saying I'll have a CSP policy in 2 days, right? But this should give you some rough idea. Right, okay, just to recap, monitoring mode CSP policy is great. Hopefully more engineers here are able to get their sites on CSP, at least in monitoring mode. And you can use the free scanner to create a policy and to analyze your existing policies. And use multi-mode CSP policy approach when you want to go into blocking mode, right? Okay, so you can reach out to me for any queries. I'll be here tomorrow as well. So if you have wanted to deploy CSP but you had issues, you can get free consulting from me for the next 24 hours, limited offer, right? You can get all your CSP queries answered, right? And you can reach out to me on Twitter as well, and please do check out the free scanner, right? All right, guys, thank you so much.